1 hour.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Good. So, glad to be here again. Before I start, I just want to have a little sense from the group. How many people, is there anyone, or how many people worked already on sustainability measurement systems and indicators? You know, how many of you have some sort of experience with that? Okay, that makes it easier. Could you say a few words about just what you did? I'll ask you to.
While my master's studies on comparative local development, we had specifically one class on sustainability measurements. Although I have to notice that most of them were basically on environmental sustainability and measures, and in different indexes, there are pluses and minuses. Pluses and minuses not only of indexes themselves, but also of what they show and what effect they can have. So, and then I read some other papers that have written something, but I mean, I have an idea of how they function, how they combine.
And what was the sector or the scale in which that?
It was not very deep, I mean, not very, but when I see index, I know what it shows, and from how calculations, I mean, in some indexes, you know more, in some others, you know less. Shortly.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I faced also with indicators while working on my PhD thesis. Because I also have, how to say, were searching for a way how to measure this concept and how to measure if the certain area is sustainable or not sustainable, in what way this area is developing and so on. And also it was like my first personal analysis and what systems of indicators, how many indicators are going in this index or that index. So can be combine all the facets in one index, or it's better to regard them separately and so on, pluses and minuses, like that.
Okay, and what was again you did this in the context of your PhD, but was that focused on a particular sector or a particular scale?
In a particular area. It is one of the region of Russia on the southwest Volgograd region. So, and I'm more focused on municipality level.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think I applied it in my country, what we call capitation grants. Capitation grant. It's a kind of grant that the government has established to support basic education. Over the schools are giving some money so that they can use those monies for pertinent, and then for sports and so on. So the government tries to pay these monies to the schools. So I wanted to look at how sustainable that grant would be by trying to look at sustainability in terms of like opportunity, coming from the World Bank and IMF ideas, that sustainability can be seen as an opportunity whereby you try to promote human capital development. So what I basically did was to adopt the Likert scale in a three-point scale, very weak, and then strong sustainability. So I identified the key stakeholders in the educational sector, the government, civil society organizations, and then the school authority. So they were involved in the study and did the rankings. So at the end of the day, I was able to work on the paper is being published.
That's great. So 3 different examples in 3 quite different contexts. So I have an impossible job, in a way, because this is a big area, and in 1 hour, it's very hard to cover everything that you would want, for even a small fraction of what you would want to cover. So I'll cover basics, and at the end, I think I'm going to show an example that I'm passionate about, because it's a place-based, specific community scale example of something that we worked on for 6-7 years, and I think it has some interesting aspects. This is from a report that I think is the best ever on this topic. It's by Dana Meadows, and it's called Indicators and Information Systems for Sustainable Development. It was done with and for members of the Balaton Group, which is an international network. And so, of course, Dana Meadows is the author of Limits to Growth, or one of the authors. What is interesting in this statement is, of course, that it recognizes that indicators are powerful. And they're powerful for a number of reasons, partly because indicators are related to what goals and ambitions and aspirations a particular community, individual, or a country sets for itself. What she also points out here is that if we wrongly use metrics, chances are we're going to go off course. Then we might end up going in directions we don't want to go. And the other thing is that it's not just the technicality of the metric and the algorithm that is important. What is important is also the process. So discovering your own metrics, as she says, is intensely democratic, is an empowering moment. And I think anyone who's participated in that type of a process, where you have your stakeholders, you involve them, in this course of discovery, it's empowering. You learn new things. You learn new things about yourself. You learn new things about where you want to go. So, what is an indicator? That's an indicator, right? What other indicators are out there? That's an indicator too. That's a more complicated indicator. And that's an even more complicated indicator. So and they come in different form and shapes. Sometimes they come in the form of maps, or charts, or many trend lines, or something almost unreadable. So basically, what are these indicators? The indicators tend to be, or should be, relatively simple, but they indicate some underlying complexity. They sit on top of something complex, but they should communicate that complexity in a clear, compelling way. I'm not sure if this is all that clear, but if you go back, there are certain things that are clearer. This is about the global production of CFCs that cause trouble to the ozone layer. Just a couple of really sort of basic things about how I think about indicators. So first of all is the relationship to values and culture. Before coming to CU for almost 20 years, I was working for the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Canada, and I was heading the Measurement and Indicators program. And right in the first year of my stint there, one day they told me there was a visiting group coming, and I was the most junior, who was the easiest to push into a position to talk to people after business hours. So, so I got stuck talking to this group who came to Winnipeg for a conference organized by the Lutheran Church of Canada. And they were interested in indicators, and I had no idea what their interest will be. So we sat down, it was 20 people, and their question was very simple: how can you link indicators to values? And I was so lost in that conversation initially. I couldn't really make the connection. It's a very strong connection, because it goes back to Dana Meadows' sentence there, is that what we value is what we should measure. If our metrics are not reflecting our values, then again we are going off track. Very often, conversations about metrics, which are technical constructs at the end of the day, start with conversations about what we value. And I'll come back to that. There's going to be a community example at the end. So simple signals of complex trends doesn't, of course, mean that all of the indicators are simple. There are many that we think are simple, but they actually are not simple. Many of you know the ecological footprint. You know the Human Development Index because you're working with that. It's a single number. It's a single line, but there's a lot of complexity underneath. That's good and bad. It's good because if the index is well constructed, that single number still tells us something valid about where the system is heading. But if it's poorly constructed, then we are in trouble because it misleads us. Now, when we pick indicators, we have to be able to say what's valid and what's not. There are good indicators and there are bad indicators. How do we tell the difference? It's based on criteria. Many groups that have been in the business of developing indicators have developed criteria, and I'll give you a few examples just in a few moments. Then indicators are always related to a context. You know, whether you work in a community in Russia, or you work in the education system somewhere else, or you work in an industry context, the indicators have to be specific to that context. That's one thing. The other part of it is that there's always an urge to compare. So if the indicators are very different, if they are completely different, then we can compare progress in one community versus another. So there's a constant tension between the need to develop metrics that are context specific to the extent possible, but at the same time they are also comparable to a degree. Indicators are process related. Data, again, Meadows said that they are intensely democratic, that experience is democratic. How you construct indicators, the steps, the process, will determine what sort of indicators you will have at the end, whether they are relevant, whether they make sense, whether they are scientifically valid. And there's a whole bunch of decisions that go into setting up that process. Who participates in what role? How do they bring their knowledge to what are the steps in that? Those are all important questions, and again, I'll show an example. Now, indicators are not data, but they feed off data. So data are the technical details that come out of monitoring system, whether that monitoring system is a satellite, or a statistical survey of education performance, or a monitoring unit of water quality. So for this reason, there's a strong reliance, obviously, on statistical agencies, but statistical agencies, interestingly, very often are not that interested in not so much in constructing indicators, but doing the interpretive work. They collect the data, primary data, they package it, they put it out. They say, well, it's up to society to do the rest. And then communication and use related to indicators is key. Actually, not even communicate, these are slightly two different things. Communication is related to packaging. Now we have so many cool and creative ways of packaging data. I know some of, you have a link to Gapminder on your website. That's a very interesting example of how data could be sort of dynamically and attractively packaged. But there are many other ways. Use is a slightly different thing. Actually, I should have put it in under a separate bullet. There are many indicators out there that are either not used or misused. And so we have to be clear on why and what happens when these indicators are misused. The GDP these days tends to be criticized for being a somewhat misleading metric. My own take on that was that maybe it's a poor metric, but I also think we don't understand what it's useful for. Maybe it's useful for something, I don't know. But it's the same thing that you have a temperature gauge that measures temperature perfectly, but is a very poor instrument for measuring weight. So it's not just what the metrics are, but how we use them. Do we understand what they actually mean? There are some metrics, of course, that are not really useful for anything. So first question is what to measure. I mentioned that this kind of goes back to the question of values. In the sustainability context, we usually think holistically. That is not just a narrow set of economic metrics or a narrow set of environmental metrics, but a system. We need frameworks. We need some conceptual framework that captures that entire sort of holistic perspective of the system. There's a spatial context for all of these metrics. It's either a community or an ecosystem or a country or a group of countries or the earth. So what is that spatial context and what is the boundary of that is an important question, and very often it's a tough question, because boundaries, especially when you work with complicated indicator sets, one type of metric, let's say for water quality, requires a watershed boundary, but let's say education data are not collected on watersheds. They are collected on school districts. So it's still the same municipality, so you constantly sort of bump into these boundary issues. Now, indicators also have a temporal dimension. They are dynamic, and when you come to collecting data, an indicator can tell you a lot more interesting stuff if you have a time series. But not even just looking back, you can also project indicators, which takes you into yet an even more interesting area of analyzing projections and scenarios. So an indicator has a place in both retrospective and forward-looking analysis. And then finally, there's this question, can or even should everything be measured? And again, I go back to Dana Meadows, who once, when we discussed this question of early days, 1990s, whether there should be a sustainable development index, like one, that could replace the GDP or something like that. And Dana said that, maybe there shouldn't be an index for everything, or we shouldn't try to build an index for everything. Because if we really tried hard, at the end of the day, we might succeed. But that might mean that if we use such an index, we might end up with a world that can be described with one index, and that would be awful. And I think that was an interesting point. So I mentioned criteria. How can you tell between a good indicator and a bad indicator? This consideration is an element in this step of building, whether either single indicators or indicator systems or aggregate or components of aggregate indices. There are many different types of criteria. These are some fairly typical ones. Obviously, an indicator has to be relevant to the underlying issue. So before you have an indicator, you have to understand what is the issue and what is the sort of the overall framework that issue is situated in. If you're dealing with, let's say, impacts of climate change, there are some specific issues. If I'm in a coastal community, my concern might be coastal flooding. If I'm in an agricultural community, my concern might be about food security or invasive species or something else. So relevance. Second is credibility. That an indicator has to be technically, scientifically credible. It has to be established. What do I measure? How do I measure it? What does it mean? Understandable. It's not just a technical thing for technical people. It has to be something that decision makers, public, and others understand. Measurable. I can, concoct some interesting metric, but if there is no methodology available to actually measure it and an instrument, then it's not useful. Robust. It has to mean the meaning has to be ideally clear of that metric. Then the next is interesting. A metric, an indicator would need to be explicit about goals, targets, and thresholds. It doesn't always happen because you can have a metric where it's a matter of value judgment what it means. For instance, in biology, let's say a population of a certain species. I like polar bears, but how many polar bears do you want? Is there an ideal number? I'm not sure there is an ideal number. So these kinds of things might be a matter of interpretation. But if you do have a goal and a target or a critical threshold, that can help interpret the indicator. It's clear, for instance, in the context of the Millennium Development Goals. Actually, the Millennium Development Goals were that I assume most of you have heard about, global level, mostly social and health related. So there were goals and there were indicators developed related to goals. So you need both. So we are clear on where we want to go, and we are clear on how we track progress or lack of progress. And there are other criteria. You talked about another issue with regard to indicators is the level of aggregation. You talked about the HDI. The HDI is an aggregate index. It sits at the top of this pyramid, and then we have indicators in the middle. Sometimes those components are aggregated, but not always. As I said, aggregation has some problems. That was the HDI structure, and you know that, so I won't dwell on it. This is an example of another an index for another sustainability domain, which is the Environmental Performance Index. This was developed a couple of years ago at Yale for the World Economic Forum, and similar aggregation methodologies as for the HDI, similar dilemmas for a different domain. And I don't think I will really dwell on it much, maybe other than saying that it has two major objectives, ecosystem vitality and environmental health. So they wanted to make sure that there's a strong link to the human dimension. These are policy categories in both of these objective areas, say air, water resources, biodiversity, agriculture, forests, and so on. And then these are the specific indicators that are related to these policy categories. Now, this is actually the cover. Well, I'm not showing this because it's a cover of a report. I'm showing this because this is an example of an indicator framework. And you can't read this, but the point is that indicators are, in a sustainability context, developed around frameworks. There are different types of frameworks. Not so simple, but one would be just 3 or 4 categories of sustainability from institutions, social, economic, and so on. This is another type of framework that is built on logic that was, I think, originally developed by Herman Daly, who was an ecological economist, and it talks about basic ultimate means and ultimate ends. Ultimate means, I'm giving this as an example. Ultimate means includes most of the material and ecological sort of resources that are needed for society to develop. Intermediate ends means all of those resources that we use as natural resources and convert them into useful products. These are intermediate ends. So those are health and education and so on. And there is an ultimate end at the top of the flower that is something like satisfaction and happiness, one thing. So you can also think about this as a pyramid from ultimate means to ultimate ends. So, and there are many, these kinds of indicator examples, and often when you enter a process, a project developing an indicator system for a sector, or for a community, or for a region, the discussion about values is followed, and issues is followed by a discussion about framework. What kind of what is the framework for our initiative? Now, there are many, of course, these discourses are full of dilemmas. One is that where is really sustainability in this? And where is very often what happens is it's actually much easier to quantify and measure unsustainability than sustainability. We know when things fail, but it's much harder to think about, how would things work really well, and not just for the next year, but the year after that and 10 years after that. So that's very difficult because there are so many sort of complexities. What I meant on power games, the next point here, is that who sets indicators can be a matter of power. Who sits at the table is a matter of power. So access to the process and whose perspective prevails is important. And because we are talking about human development here, making sure that the perspective of the poor are reflected here, that they sit at the table and those perspectives get heard, that's very important. Capacity issues, very often when we think about indicator system related capacity problems, usually people think about things like, okay, we don't have enough data, we don't have analytic capacity, we are poor, we don't have computers, we don't have GIS, we have no access to satellites and so on. We can't publish. Fine, that's one thing. There's another type of capacity problem, however, and that's the problem at the end of the user. Because very often, you can produce the best data packaged in the nicest way, yet it won't make a difference. There are many reasons for that, but one reason for that is that the decision maker, the one, whether it's the household level or the public servant or whoever else, doesn't get it. They don't have the capacity. They have they're on a narrow track. They have single vision. They're not interested in the big picture. It's complicated. That means that they are ignoring risks probably, but they just can't get it. So there are capacity issues also at that end. Local indicators of global change, cross-scale issues are important. So there is, in this business of indicator development, there are initiatives across all scales. Right now, one of my first initiatives in this area in 1994 was, and that was the first ever sort of compendium of who does what on indicators. So I wrote that in '94. We had some, maybe about 200 initiatives in it. Half of them were Canadian because we like to focus on Canada, but there were other internationals. And then we put it on the web, and right now it kind of gave it up, updating it, but it has about 1,000 initiatives in it listed, and there's an order of magnitude more initiatives that are trying to do this kind of an indicator system development. So how these are related to each other is a really interesting question. There is a risk, and I think many realize that at the end of the day, we can end up with an indicator Tower of Babel. And what does that mean is that, when you are, your community in Vladivostok is developing its own indicator system, and another one in Sao Paulo, and the third one in Lisbon, and so on, we will do it all in a different way, and we end up with different things. Sometimes measuring the different same thing in different ways and so on. You lose comparability. You lose an ability to communicate. I'm not even saying that we should be all measuring everything the same way all across the board, but we would need to be thinking about at least these issues of comparability. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second. And I need some water. Can I stop? I'm doing this. Thanks. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I have one question regarding indicators, Millennium Development Goals, sustainability indicators. I don't know how it's in other countries, and I hope that they are doing much better than we. But in the thing in Lithuania, the country where I'm coming from, Millennium Goals, Development Goals are interested in the goals are interested in only people who are dealing with this. Mostly, maybe I'm a bit exaggerating, but to keep it simple and understandable. So my question would be, and for simple people, they like Millennium Development Goals.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? We are trying to live here more or less.
Yeah.
So my question would be how it's possible to translate Millennium Development Goals, sustainability indicators, and other indicators that we are attempting to measure our progress and the way ahead to human-friendly language and to simple language that simple people could use it.
Okay. Maybe I'll show an example now.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is an answer, but is there there's internet, right?
Can I ask a question while you are looking?
Go ahead.
If I'm mistaken, Lithuania promised, the government of Lithuania promised to achieve development goals by 2015, and it should be on the agenda of the parliament. They keep it in mind when they design their budget each year. So how can it be?
I will tell you very frankly, can I? From very low, level, not to the high level. Millennium goals are on parliament agenda, on government agenda, on all agendas you can think of, and policies and all documents. We have Lithuanian sustainability strategy. All this exists, but when you go to people's level, the people what they live and how they do, they actually it doesn't mean anything. Nearly anything to those people. That's the biggest problem. I mean, because we as a humankind, we could contribute at least little by our small maybe shifts in our daily routines, to contribute in the use of energy, other resources. But people, they don't have idea because everything stays at strategies, policies level, etc.
Okay. So, this is an example of a community scale system. So this is not MDGs. And the discourse didn't start with indicators. The discourse started about well-being. Are people easier to make people interested in well-being than in MDGs?
Of course.
I would think so, right? And poverty. So lots of discourse on, what are the domains of well-being? What is well-being? I mean, that's a simple conversation. So we had lots and lots of discussions with, Aboriginal groups and old and young and poor and not poor and so on. And, language came out of the discourse that kind of defined, not in an academic sense, but for all those who were involved, defined well-being. They said, okay, that's what we mean on this. Yeah. And then we said, okay, so if you think health is part of, are people interested in health? Yes. Yeah. Okay, so then what's in health? Of course, health is so broad too, but we said, we don't want too broad. I mean, we just want a couple of things. You can always make things more complex. But what it is that you're really, really concerned about. And then they start talking about, okay, well, we are interested in mothers being alone. This is one particular community, single moms and so on. That's an issue. Maternal social isolation. We said, okay, that's an issue. Then young girls getting pregnant, teenage births. That was important. Injuries was important. Premature mortality, people dying too young was important. So, they kind of unpack this. And then we said, okay, so what does it mean? Then the discussion went on from that broad level to the more specific about how do you actually measure this. So we got to the indicator, but we didn't start with that indicator. And and then you can go ahead and define it and involve your experts and gather your data. But that's part of the answer. So you don't start a discussion with the MDGs, you start a discussion about issues that people understand. The other thing is that there are some people out there who are numerical and who get worked up by seeing charts and numbers, but not everybody is like that. Okay, we also need stories. So then we created, and that's being worked on, and there's no story, you see a button there, stories. So we need to collect stories from people. Like, what does this really mean? Okay, teenage births. So what are the stories from the community? And what would go there, what will go there, is actual stories with actual people from the community. This is what it means. This is my reality. And then, those who are interested in the numbers will have access to the numbers. Those who don't really get that can read the story, and those who get both, they are in nirvana because they understand picture. And of course, you need to look at this over time, and you also thought it was important that that people have the ability to look at over space, because people said that I want to know what's my So that's a map with neighborhoods. So you can look at these these kinds of things in your neighborhood. Okay, so that's okay. 20 minutes. So any other questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask whether a democratic approach in forming indicators results in a good indicator.
I don't think there is really a straightforward answer that. I don't think this process has an end. When we build something like this thing that's called the PEG, we thought of that as a new piece of community infrastructure. Okay, so what's the characteristic feature of infrastructure is that it's quasi-permanent. The need that infrastructure addresses is a constant need. And we thought that there was a fundamental gap in our public infrastructure in the sense that we are not providing access to facts and data on an ongoing and straightforward and clear way to people. So we thought that we have to build this as a new piece of infrastructure, and then in that sense, it doesn't have an end. We are not building this to be perfect, because there is no such a way to make it perfect. We're considering this a social learning process. So it's going to evolve, and actually that helped us a lot at the beginning, because people got when this idea was discussed first, then everybody got scared. It's not cheap. B, it needs a lot of energy. And then we said, okay, don't worry. We're not going to build the Eiffel Tower in one step. We're going to construct this step by step over time. And that's exactly what we did. It took 7 years. And then we didn't get things right. And then, you never get it right, but you learn. I mean, I think that's more important. Okay, so maybe I'll go on just in the interest of time. Now, one additional thing that this goes back again to mid-90s, when many of these, there was no ecological footprint, and there was many of these aggregate indices that exist today. They were not there yet, and we were considering whether this is an area where we want to make a difference, and we decided that was one of the options, that we would develop our own sort of sustainability index. There was an alternative, and we took the alternative, and the alternative was to focus, instead of one more aggregate index, to focus on principles of measurement, because we realized even at that time that in many ways it was interesting and possible for many actors out there, companies, communities, governments, and so on, to sort of enter this field. And we saw that there's going to be some sort of not explosion, but significant growth of interest in this area. And we also saw that there were questions about how to do all this. Now, we didn't want to define a set methodology that is so rigid that the first thing people do is take it apart and sort of just discard the whole thing. We wanted to provide very high level, very generic principles that can inform the discussions that will be ongoing at the different levels. So we developed the first set of these principles, and then a couple of years ago we took a look at them, and we simplified these set of principles. They were known initially as the Bellagio principles. Now they are called the Bellagio Sustainability Assessment and Measurement Principles, or Bellagio STEM. And I'm just going to, there was a whole bunch of authors. We developed this in partnership with the OECD. And those are the principles. So what do they say? So first principle is guiding vision. And this principle is about the importance of having a direction. And that direction has to be, at the most macro level, achieving human well-being within the capacity of the biosphere to support human aspirations. So it's consistent with sustainability. Now, this has far-reaching consequences, especially if you try to come up with metrics at the sub-global level, because very often that vision is either is not there and is difficult to identify. It's politically risky. They don't like to do it. You know, once you have a vision, you know, that kind of creates a direction, and then you can hold people to account. But we thought that was important, and at the macro level, it has to be within the carrying capacity of the biosphere. So then there were a couple of what we thought were essential considerations that you have to sort of discuss right at the outset of these types of processes. So first of all, you won't, by the way, you won't hear anything that's new here. This is just, I think the collection is what I think is interesting. First of all, you need to consider the system, the social, ecological, environmental. This is sort of fundamental for sustainability, and the interactions between these components. Governance is very often the orphan of the sustainability discourse. Maybe not so much today, because we know that governance is really failing at many levels, so it's easier to identify. But we thought this was important to identify separately and emphasize. So, current trends and drivers of change. The interaction of these two need to be covered by the metrics. Risk, uncertainties, and activities that can have an impact across boundaries. That's basically looking across, looking at transboundary issues, and look at trade-offs and synergies. That is, if you gain in one area, let's say in terms of human well-being, what do you sacrifice? Or vice versa, you know, if you gain in the environment area, what do you sacrifice in some of the other domains? Adequate scope is principle 3. This is about both the need and the difficulty of defining the spatial and the temporal boundaries of this indicator system. Any given indicator system, you know, if nothing else, it will have global applicability. But they all have some sort of underlying system with some boundaries. Framework and indicators. This I already mentioned that a conceptual framework is needed in the early stages before you get to indicators, and before even you get to specific issues. And there is reliable data projections and models that can be built on the basis of that conceptual framework. So these assessments also need to be based on. There's a language error there. I just realized that. Most recent data, I think, and to infer trends and build scenarios. This link hasn't been made before. Now, why are scenarios interesting? Because they are instruments and methods to look into the future. Now, scenarios are complicated, but one way to both build and to interpret scenarios is to look at what are the key variables. For instance, I can build a scenario, for instance, on food security for the future, but besides sort of qualitatively describing what that scenario, where that scenario leads, would be to take one particular metric or two and say, okay, it's the number of malnourished children. You know, let's take that as an indicator. What happened to undernourishment in this scenario, and project that into the future. This sort of link between scenarios and indicators, at least initially, was not really well understood. So I already talked about comparability and standardized measurement. So I think that's hopefully clear. And also the comparison with targets and benchmarks. Now, you might have, you mentioned MDGs, and there are MDG-related indicators. We also have MDG-related goals. Now, in the current political context, the next interesting question will be the Sustainable Development Goals. You know that, I think we talked about that, SDGs in principle got accepted in Rio +20. There will be a process to develop an extended set of goals, maybe even targets. So that's going to be relevant, and there will be indicators related to those and a tracking mechanism. Principle 5 is transparency. Transparency is interesting, and it is related to the indicators being potentially influential, but also potentially risky. You know, if there is no transparency, people won't understand what the indicators suggest, or you know, they can be manipulative as well. So the first sort of criteria here is that the underlying data has to be accessible to the public. So not just so people can check the facts. Are the indicators really you know, suggesting what we see on the surface? The second is the choices, assumptions, uncertainties need to be clarified. What kinds of assumptions? You know, when there are many important phenomena out there that cannot be directly measured. So you develop proxy measures, and when we identify these proxy or indirect measures of something, we make assumptions that this is a good metric. Those assumptions need to be clear. And same way, there are also uncertainties, and these uncertainties play a big role in determining the sort of the impact of the assessments. Disclose data sources and methods, and finally, sources of funding and potential conflicts of interest should be disclosed. Because, you know, depending on who the funder is, they might have second thoughts on why they actually want certain types of data to be collected. So that we thought was important to be recognized. Effective communication is, I like elegance in communication, in simplicity. That's how we try to build that PEG tool that I showed you. Of course, you can always make things more complex, but it's important to keep it simple. I mean, that applies to language, you know, both to the analysis. Don't make it too. Of course, you know, if you're writing a journal paper, that's fine. You know, you use whatever language is applicable at that level. But for the public and decision makers, it has to be plain and simple. So, present information in a fair and objective way that helps build trust. So the information has to be understandable. Our partner in that community project was a local sort of umbrella of NGOs called the United Way. They're not terribly strong in Europe, but in North America that's a major organization, and they are known for being fairness and caring and dealing with poverty issues and so on. So, so this trust and fairness in the communication was extremely important, down to the point of whose pictures get on the website, and what are some of the other subtle messages that you want to send to make people both understand the issues better and to feel more comfortable with exploring some of the ideas. Use innovative visual tools and graphics and tell a story. And I think I talked about that too. Make data available in as much detail as practical and reliable. There are two more principles. So number 7 is about broad participation. And I think already I touched on that. So obviously it's important to involve many stakeholders in this process. But at the same time, leadership is also interesting, because what we found was that, that initiatives that were successful always had clear leadership. If that's not there, the initiative is not going anywhere. So that leadership is key. And it comes with vision, or ability to sort of construct an inclusive vision. And in that, then it's not just engaging people, it's also how you engage them. Engage them before critical decisions are made. So the timing of that engagement is key. That's an example also from the same community initiative, and you see that that we put engagement with the local citizenry there in the middle. That's kind of the engine. That's the axis of this whole initiative. And if you look at it, it's ongoing. It starts with developing a shared vision for the community, indicator selection and story development, information and knowledge system construction. That's a more sort of technical thing. But also, even in that more technical thing, we had countless number of feedback sessions with the potential user who are non-experts, from the young kid to the old pensioner and so on, to test that system is going to resonate. Then communication, reporting and outreach, evaluation, learning and improvement, and the cycle goes on, and there's an overall sort of direction towards positive community change and shared vision. So that we call that an operating model for the entire system. Then this is the last principle on continuity and capacity. I talked about this being a new piece of community infrastructure at the community, whether it's the community level or at the system of national accounts level or at the level of enterprises. Almost doesn't matter. So what is important here is there's repeated measurement. Of course, at the national level, we have statistical agencies that have been historically set up. They measure what they measure. Very often, they don't always measure what they should, but I think they are evolving. And by the way, there is just a new, just this year, they approved a new system of integrated environmental, economic, social accounting framework. So I think the system is definitely learning. And responsiveness to change. The fact that we set up one set of metrics 1 year doesn't mean that it's going to stay there forever. Many people don't know, but even if you look at stock market indices, Standard and Poor and so on, people think that it's always the same. There is standard way to make it. That's not true. Why? Because 10 years ago there was no Google. Right now Google is in the S&P 400. Right? So those indices are also changing. There's no reason why these kinds of indicator sets or indices should stay the same. They need to change. They need to reflect the new concerns. And finally, there's a need to invest in these issues. This is not cheap. This is not simple. This is not quick. It takes time, but there's payoff. So there's also continuous learning and improvement. This whole sort of set of principles was used already in a number of cases, and this is not even an up-to-date list. I won't really dwell on that. Maybe, just the last couple of points. There are many international initiatives that have been started recently meaning the last 3-4 years, that I think are note and of some importance. The OECD played, I think, a particularly interesting role because traditionally this is not an organization that is interested in sustainability issues. This is the Rich Countries Club. But up to and including the Secretary General, they bought into this. On the one hand, the criticism of the GDP-based unidimensional thinking, and they initiated the OECD Global Project. There were a number of meetings, products, analysis. So I think that's a useful initiative. GPRNet is the global network, Global Progress Research Network, under the Global Project that is trying to sort of spread the word. Beyond GDP is an EU-initiated initiative, sort of a sister initiative of the OECD project at the EU level. Another example, Community Indicator Consortium. It's a US-based large network, and we established ourselves the Canadian Sustainability Indicators Network, and there are many others. So it's a busy area. In Rio Plus 20 is this question of evidence base and beyond GDP thinking got more attention than I expected. I hope that attention stays and doesn't fizzle out, because it can happen. If it doesn't fizzle out, it can lead to good things. I think that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Questions? I mean, we are on the hour, so.
No, we can continue.
If we have questions, okay.
Please, colleagues. Was it so clear that no questions, so unclear that actually you don't know what to ask?
Indicators are clear. What do you think, what indicators that we have for sustainable human development we need to change to improve, what are not up to date for now? What is your opinion on this?
So, what indicators do we need, or what are the domains where we need to change?
Yes, some domains which we need to change.
In terms of behavior and so on?
Yes.
Lots. That's a big question. Yeah.
Do you think we need to include any other domain? Like, is it enough to have social, environmental, and economics here?
Well, I think government, in many of the failures or lack of progress that we've seen, I think are failures of governance. And what does governance mean? It's an ability, collective ability of institutions, formal or informal institutions, to realize a problem and to undertake effective action and be accountable for results. So I think governments and other players are not really stepping up to the challenge, I think. So many people are suggesting that we need to get better at that, but we also need some way of tracking or quantifying or measuring this inability of our governance system to deliver results. I don't know if it's possible. I completely agree that's an important area. I'm just not sure we will be very good at actually measuring that. I'm less optimistic about it. If I sort of step aside, what other areas we really need to change, I think we need to understand the impacts of overconsumption on the one hand, and how uneconomic overconsumption can be. Do you understand what that would mean? Uneconomic. It means that above a certain level of consumption, consuming one more unit of food, goods, is pointless. It doesn't make you happier. That's not the point. That's not the point. That's uneconomic consumption. You spend money, you create pollution, you use energy, you produce greenhouse gases, but to what end? If it doesn't make you more satisfied, in a way happier, what's the point? What's the point of it? So you know, that's one area where and there are interesting initiatives. You know, most of you have heard about the Gross National Happiness Initiative of Bhutan, which I think is, there's leadership there. Very interesting stuff. So I think we need some you know, progress in that area. On the other hand, I think we also have to realize just how serious the ongoing poverty problems are, and that you know, we haven't, you know, in absolute terms, the number of malnourished people hasn't declined. We still have, and project to have, as many hungry 10 years from now, if things continue like today, as we had before. Proportionally, they might go down, maybe, but in absolute numbers, they won't. So that's a problem, and you know, it's not just the numbers and the metrics that will make a difference, but there are some facts out there that need to get out. Okay.
Other questions, please? Don't be too shy.
Okay. Right. Okay. In the back first.
Yes, we talked about this, that we shall measure what we value. So actually, there should be a democratic process about choosing the indicators, because I guess if the community doesn't use it, it's useless. But do you think that it's more a two-way relationship, that indicators perhaps can also have influence on values of a community, for example?
Finish your talk.
Just for example, like if you can show by an indicator the extent of environmental damage, then people slowly might begin to value environmentally conscious behavior or something like that. Right?
Absolutely. I completely look at that as a two-way process. Yes, we should be choosing the metrics. The metrics should reflect the values, and the metrics we choose will, of course, feedback on values. I mean, if we have a completely, you know, money-based, GDP-based society, if those are the metrics out there, society will conform to that. And that's exactly what we see. But if you change that perspective, you know, society could learn. So again, the dynamics of that, I think, is very important. And I saw it. It's easier to do at a small community level because, you know, people know each other, they trust each other. If you gain their trust, and that takes time, it's easier to have these discourses, and lots of very interesting discoveries can happen. At the higher political level, that gets more complicated. But I don't think, you know, 1,000 different small initiatives, I don't think they are a replacement for the higher level political process. I think we need both. Yes.
And my question was very shortly follow the answer of my colleague question. Since the governments are failing in communicating and these indicators and the means, whether you believe that the closer cooperation also with private sector, as we heard in some previous lectures today and yesterday, could help to get the better way through and towards sustainability, or maybe also cooperation not only government, like public and private sector, but also communities, how to connect all these three.
Yeah. See, I mean, I don't draw a very clear line of separation between private sector, civil society, and government. I mean, these are, you know, we have one society. Of course, you know, they are separate, but we still live on one earth. We are still connected. Not always in the right way, but we are still connected. So somewhere the interests, you know, meet. And I don't think we can say that governments overall are failing. first of all, there are some governments that are taking these things seriously. In Bhutan, I gave you the example of Bhutan. Amazing leadership. It's worth going on the web. You can see the speech of the Prime Minister, even at Rio 20 or others. It's worth listening to because the guy knows what he's talking about. So some governments are not failing. The other thing is that governments, there is still some progress. It's not always in the right direction. It's not fast enough. But there are things happening. I mean, if I just stick strictly speaking to this agenda, we have invested. Statistical agencies have invested in their capacity. I'm not a statistician, by the way. They have invested. We had discourses that kind of push us ahead. In China, about 4 or 5 years ago, Han Yue was the deputy minister of environment. He made the Chinese leadership buy into the idea of the green GDP. They invested a chunk of money, put fair enough of capacity behind this concept. After 2 years, the whole thing died. Han Yue got demoted, and there's still no green GDP for China. But it was an interesting example showing that there is interest in this in governments. I think the problem was there was two problems. They underestimated the amount of effort in conceptual, the technical challenges of that. The second was that there were other interests in and outside of government that realized that if they shift to green GDP, they would lose certain things. And it's not necessarily you would lose bad things society-wide, but they would lose. And they were probably powerful enough for this experiment to stop. Okay, fine, fair enough. I'm pretty sure, actually, China is going to go back to that in a different way, and they're going to go further. So I don't think it's hopeless. I think there's learning happening. It's just not fast enough. Yeah. So, okay.
I have a question.
Yeah. Is that allowed?
You were mentioning on several occasions consumption.
Yeah.
But and this non-economic consumption has to make sense to consume to a certain threshold. Fair enough. But consumption is often, I would say, too often status manifestation driven.
It's
manifesting a status. I can afford driving a hammer. I can afford driving twice bigger hammer than yours. And if you look at media, mass culture, I mean, it is not quite clear that the patterns of consumption which are promoted are in fact conducive to sustainable development. So, how do we go around this, and how can we make the link between measurement frameworks and indicators with policy implications and consumer behavior implications?
Okay. Well, I had one sentence many years ago in my PhD thesis that said something about this, that basically something like this, that if all the resources that are spent by the media on promoting the type of lifestyles that go directly against the ideals of all of these, that of sustainability, if just a fraction of those resources were redirected and spent on promoting the right kinds of thinking and behavior, that would be a huge step ahead. So I think, I can answer this in different ways, but I think the question of media and advertising, what do we promote? I think that's huge, and it's clear. I mean, there must be ethical standards for advertising, but maybe in Bhutan, but okay, not very optimistic.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
When we're talking about Bhutan, it's pretty different because, if I'm not mistaken, Bhutan has a human happiness index of how it is. It's right from the king. It's not. Everybody it's been 5-6 years since I've known about it, or what they're having about it. So comparing, it's just a comment that Bhutan has human happiness index of how it is, which is pretty different from human development index, and many have argued that measuring human happiness index is very difficult, I guess, and how would you measure happiness? Well, there's another interesting part of your presentation that I did like is that you referred to leadership.
Yeah.
So it might be a little out of context, but when talking about leadership, have you devised any sort of measuring features of how effective leadership can be there? And if from the very beginning, if you have a good leader, probably while formulating these indexes, there can be chances of success.
Yeah, no, we haven't. I mean, you know, we looked at processes
It's the outcome you're looking at. Even the input should be.
Yeah, the input is right. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, what I would say, you know, leadership is an aspect of governance. You know, we discussed that. Difficult stuff, very important. But it's a qualitative. Very often, it's a qualitative thing, and you either have it or you don't have it, or you know, it might be evolving. It's tough, but still, you know, just my qualitative, intuitive experience is that that makes it. I think everybody that makes a huge difference in these kinds of things. You know, it doesn't sound right, but in many community scale, other types of initiatives, you have the right women or men there. It can make all the difference. It's the role of the individual. That's an interesting topic.
I remember a couple of years back there was a book from some Australian author who looked at the impact of leaderships on suicide. That study was there, and they looked at the Prime Minister and the policy of the person in the command.
Oh yeah. So one sort of step. We did analyze some 35, 40 country sustainability strategies a couple of years ago, and one of our analytic criteria there was leadership. Where is leadership? You know, these are sort of country strategies. Sometimes they call sustainability strategies. Sometimes they're called something else. But integrated and leadership. You know, where does leadership sit? Sits. Who has it? How much leadership they actually provide, other than just having authority. You know, those are all important questions. We didn't put a metric on it, but it was part of the analysis. So I think I have a very good answer. And for Bhutan, I think Bhutan is an experiment. I think it would be way too early right now to judge how far Bhutan got. Okay, they studied this, a couple of years ago. What's a couple of years? I think we have to be patient, and I don't think we can measure happiness. I don't think we will ever be able to measure happiness. It's a term we use for a collection of some qualities that I think are closer to describing what we should aspire for than GDP. That's how I see it.
I have a related question to what you just said. It's more from some philosophical realm, and I'm sorry for that. You said we need time to see how far Bhutan will go. But it's a very tricky point you make, because if we introduce some index and we try to kind of have it as a benchmark, and then to turn out that it was completely wrong, and we missed out probably 50% of the population, we did not address that problem, and a lot of time. How or can we actually take into account these? Because this
the risk of failure.
Yeah, the risk of failure, or.
But we are already failing.
What's
the alternative?
We are failing on so many respects, and it's I don't know.
Okay, I mean that takes again a little far. We live in there's the whole literature complex adaptive systems. I think about we live in complex adaptive systems with great degrees of uncertainty, and I think many of the policies we use today. They are not acknowledged as such, but they are actually experiments. We are in a transition age with enormous amounts of risk and complexity and uncertainty. And we got here because of the system that we had. So I think what Bhutan does is experimenting. I mean, yes, there are risks. Yes, there are liabilities. Because especially that's not, it's not a democratic state in the sense of, it's becoming that, but it has a king and so on. The king, he abrogated, he's no longer king, but So there are risks, but it's an experiment. It's a learning. How do we learn from this? I think is the question. And are they able to sort of do short cycle learning so if they really go off track, that they can reverse? And this is a longer discussion, and I think we have
Okay, thank you very much.